I did my author study on Patricia Polacco, who's actually an American author. However, her stories are about her family history and stories that were told to her by her Ukrainian grandmother and what they went through as children, as well as the struggles Patricia Polacco also went through as a child. So in the absence of a television set, Polacco grew up hearing many stories told to her by her Ukrainian grandmother. Keeping with tradition, she retold these stories to her own children. Polacco did not begin to write down or illustrate her family history until she was about 41 years old. She has very fond memories of her Russian, Irish, and Ukrainian grandparents. She spent many hours learning from them and listening to their stories and learning about kind of what they went through as children, how their life was like, and she kind of made those connections to her life. In elementary school, Polacco moved from her family farm in Michigan, where she lived with her mother and grandma, and moved to Oakland, California, where she says her neighbors came in as many colors, ideas, and religions as there are people. She began making those connections from her family stories that were told to her and the religions that she learned about, and made those connections to her new friends and the people she lived around. Throughout her school years, Patricia Polacco struggled with reading. She was far behind many of her classmates, and she was teased just enough to think that maybe she actually was dumb. It wasn't until Polacco turned 14 when one of her high school teachers recognized that maybe she had dyslexia. Once she received additional help, Polacco learned to read very well and caught up with her classmates. Although reading was her struggle, her ability as an artist was never in question. Actually, her classmates were very impressed by her artwork, and Polacco says her art is what inspired her to keep wanting to go to school and what kept her interested and engaged. Polacco went on to graduate from college with a degree in fine art and eventually earning her PhD in art history. After working in art restoration, she became a mother and dedicated just much of her time just to her children. When Patricia Polacco's son was diagnosed with diabetes, she made a wordless picture book to help him understand what he needed to do exactly to take care of himself. Polacco then started to write down and illustrate the old family stories that were told to her by her grandmother, and as well as her own struggles with dyslexia. Patricia Polacco joined the Society of the Children's Book and Illustrators, where she learned to prepare picture books for publication. In a whirlwind trip to New York, Polacco met with 16 different publishers and sold many of her own stories. She has written and published more than 115 children's books. After living much of her life in urban California, Patricia Polacco moved her family back to her family farm in Michigan. She lives in her renovated old house, which also serves as an art and storytelling center for local children. Just one block away, in another old family home, Polacco has her own art studio where she continues to create children's books based on her old family stories. A common character you will see in Polacco's books is the character Babushka, which means grandmother in Russian. By this, you can kind of tell her grandmother played a great role in her life, and she's kind of paying tribute to her by using her in a lot of her work. Another theme kind of and characters you'll see in Patricia Polacco's work is strong adult figures. You can tell these figures played a positive role in her life. Another person you will see that played a positive role in her life is her high school teacher that recognized she had dyslexia and who worked with her on learning how to read. In her writing, Polacco often discusses many very heavy topics. However, she makes them suitable for young readers. Some of the common topics and themes discussed in her writing is death, integrity, honesty, bullying, friendship, family, love, values, traditions, and understanding differences. The way her themes are woven within the plot of her books is often thoughtful and very well executed, in my opinion. Polacco uses adjectives that are often unexpected and help to create a vivid image in the reader's mind. The author uses verbs to catch her reader's attention. She often uses verbs that the readers would not automatically pair up with the subject, so to get you thinking. And she uses those verbs also in a way to provide diversity in language. The use of runaway sentence in Polacco's books create a frantic, desperate, and or excited feeling in her work. Personification and direct context sentences in the introduction and the hook that she gets you on are also common styles you'll see in most of her writing. So something that you'll see often with Patricia Polacco's illustrations is her line work is varied and often wonky and crazy. You'll see this a lot in her characters. They're stylistic, however, they're distorted figures. They often have overly rosy cheeks and exaggerated facial expressions. Okay, so Thank You, Mr. Fokker is a story about a young girl who, such as Patricia Polacco's self, who struggles with dyslexia without even realizing it, and her teacher helps her work through that struggle. Trisha loves to paint and draw, but words didn't make sense to her, and her old teacher didn't pick up on her disability. As a result, she thought she was just stupid. Trisha and her family moved across the country, and Trisha felt dumb and was bullied at school. But when she meets Mr. Fokker, who helps her to read by having her stay behind every day with him, and a reading teacher to help her learn how to read. So, Thank You, Mr. Fokker is a book about Patricia Polacco's struggle as a child. She faced adversity through her struggle learning to read due to dyslexia. She was able to overcome this disability thanks to one of her teachers at the age of 14 and is now a very accomplished writer. So some things you could do with this book in your classroom is you could direct it towards social and emotional learning and maybe have a conversation about that and use that just, to talk about children's self-esteem and bullying. An activity that I really liked with this that I thought would be good is have students journal about a time maybe they struggled with something in school and possibly check in on those journals. Just you as a teacher check in on the journals and see if maybe you recognize some of those struggles in those students and see if they're still struggling with those and maybe have a conversation with them about it. This book is also a very good book to talk about bullying and just how to prevent it. You can also introduce students to self-esteem and the importance of feeling good about yourself, even though you may not know how to do something that someone else knows how to do. Tucky Joe and Little Heart is another book by Patricia Polacco. This is about a kid from Kentucky who was enlisted in the Army at the age of 15 years old. Being the youngest recruit in the Pacific during World War II was very tough. But he finds a friend in a little girl who helps him soothe his bug bites and gets to know her family and gives them some of his rations to help her family not die of starvation. Although this little girl does not speak English and is from the Philippines, Tucky Joe and Little Heart share the language of kindness. Many years later, Tucky Joe and Little Heart meet again, and an act of kindness is returned when it's needed the most in the touching picture book based on a true story. So this story is actually based on a family history that was told to Patricia by her grandparents. So, an activity that I really liked with this story was in the story, they make a dancing doll. And so I think you could have your class make a dancing doll, like Tucky Joe made for Little Heart, and the dancing doll made them forget the war for a while and just kind of put a smile on their faces. A strategy that that could be used for this book is to talk about loyalty, kindness, and the importance of friendship. And it shows you how you can be friends with someone who is different than you and maybe less fortunate as you. It also shows how much you can learn from someone else. You can also talk about in the story what Tucky Joe learned from Little Heart throughout his journey. Another good teaching point would be talk about the Philippines and what people went through during World War II, as well as the differences that maybe we face in the United States or during that time. You could connect it to a social studies lesson. Mr. Lincoln's Way is another story told by Patricia Polacco. It is a true story, and so everyone thinks Eugene, Mean Gene is what they called him, the school bully, he's trouble. And everyone but Mr. Lincoln, who is the coolest principal in the world, as well as an African American, he's determined to reach out to the boy who is caught calling other African American kids racist names. Mr. Lincoln enlists in Eugene's help in attracting birds to the school, and a project the fourth grader embraces with enthusiasm. Eugene loved birds, so that's how Mr. Lincoln kind of got to him to help him out. Nevertheless, he made racist remarks and lands in the principal's office once again, where Eugene shares that his old man calls Mr. Lincoln very ugly names, and how he's different from us, and how anybody who's different from him, his dad will call names. So, an activity for this, I thought you could create a profile on a couple characters. So, one on Mr. Lincoln, discussing, for example, like you could identify the character's physical characteristics, occupation, character traits, motivations, feelings, etc., and then create a character profile on Eugene and kind of look at the differences and maybe some of the feelings they had towards each other. Another thing I liked for this is maybe have students journal about someone who plays a positive role in their life or helped them when they needed it, such as Mr. Lincoln played for Eugene. A strategy, I thought it would be good to discuss about calling people names just because they don't look like you or they're not the same as you, like how that's not okay. And talk about differences in appearance and how that doesn't set you apart from other people. Another book is Miss Cats and Tush. It's about an elderly widow and a scrawny abandoned kitten provided each other with love and comfort in this picture book. Lonely after her husband's death, Miss Katz appreciates the frequent visits from her young neighbor Larnell and his mother. Things began to look particularly bright when the boy offers the runt of the litter kittens to Miss Katz, and Larnell helps the old woman care for her new tailless pet, Tush. And in return, Miss Katz shares freshly baked kugel and stories of her Polish homeland and her Jewish heritage. So, a good activity I thought would be, this would obviously be for older students, but students could compare Black history, which is what Larnell and his family was, to the Jewish heritage Miss Katz was familiar with, and do that using a Venn diagram. Some things I thought you could talk about is you could talk about Judaism and the Jewish community, and talk about how diversity really exists wherever you go in the world, whether you're at school, in the grocery store, things like that. And obviously, these activities would be used for a more older audience. Pink and Say is the last book I chose, and it's an important story about two soldiers in the Civil War. It talks about how Pink finds Say wounded on a battlefield and pulls him to safety at his mother's home. During Say's recovery, Pink and Say spend more time learning about each other and developing a deep friendship. Eventually, the boys are caught and separated, unsure and concerned about the other's fate. For an activity, you could pretend to be Pink or Say and write a journal entry about one of the days they spend together. You could discuss the theme of friendship and hope and have students log the different times they see these themes in the story. And for older students, use this book for a research project on the Civil War.